again, Brother Mark, and we're back, brethren and sisters, to consider this very sad portion of Genesis chapter 9, although it has a very wonderful outcome. In fact, we're going to find that all of us in this room have played our part in the fulfilment of a portion of Noah's prophecy, which he gives after the tragic, sad events that we read of in verses 20 onwards to 23. Verses 18 and 19, however, point out how the earth was overspread. We read there in verse 18, "For the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham is the father of Canaan." And we're going to consider all three of these in their context. We're going to see what part each of them plays in the prophecies of Noah. So out they came from the ark here on the mountains of Ararat, and they overspread the earth eventually, of course, to every part of it, initially into this immediate area of where the ark had landed, but in different areas. The Japhethites went basically to the north, the Shemites here to the Fertile Crescent, as it was once called, and the Hamites to the south, particularly the land of Canaan, of course. They were there when Abraham came into that land. So we're told that this is the way. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. When you look at a table of the nations, the various colours here show us where they ended up. The Japhethites are this darkish, reddish sort of colour that you can see extended around here in the north. The Shemites are this sandy kind of colour, which is very appropriate for the Arabian desert. And the green is the area that the Hamites settled in. And you can see that the land of Canaan is green. Now God, of course, had a hand in some of this. He was making sure that Canaanites were in the land of Canaan when Abraham came there. And we'll see the reason for that a bit later on. So this is what verses 18 and 19 are telling us. Now, the Apostle Paul actually speaks about this in Acts chapter 17 and verse 26. And he says that God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. And we know he was talking to, here in Acts 17, to the Areopagites, to the philosophers of the day, to men who had been schooled in Greek philosophy and wisdom. And they were about as wise as modern philosophers. And what in actual fact has happened is that this statement of the Apostle Paul has been challenged by modern scientists. And they say, well, this can't be right. You know, and God has made of one blood all nations of men. And they say, well, it can't be right because there are different blood types. Now, if we were to take the blood type of each of us in this room, there would be different blood types, wouldn't there? But, of course, typical of these philosophers, they had no idea. In the Greek, the word blood is omitted. The RV renders it, hath made of one. And, of course, Paul's not talking about blood. He's talking about the origins of all men. They are made of one. Now, we all came initially from Adam. He's the father of the human race. But of course, when God wiped out the entire human race except for 8 people, we came of another one. All of us have come from the loins of Noah. All of us here today have a forefather. His name is Noah. Our original forefather is Adam. And that's all Paul means here. God made of one all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. And that's what Genesis chapter 9 verses 18 and 19 is essentially telling us. Weymouth translates this phrase, he caused to spring from one forefather people of every race, which of course is a pretty simple explanation of what Paul was saying on the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17. Then we come to the record of verse 20, and it says this, "And Noah began to be an husbandman, and he planted a vineyard." It was to be the beginning of the troubles that beset him and his family. Now this word husbandman is in fact 2 Hebrew words, ish, adamah. Don't need to tell you that they come from Genesis chapter 2. Genesis 2 talks about how God made man, Adam, from the dust of the ground. And at the end of that chapter, Adam takes a wife that is created for him from his side by God. He's called Ish, all right, and she's called Ishar. She is taken out of man. And ish is a Hebrew word that normally does service in the Old Testament for a great man. And we know that that had to be the case because the first Adam was a type of the second Adam. He's a type of the great man whose bride would come from his side. And when the Roman soldier plunged the spear into his side, forthwith, it says, there came forth blood and water, the elements by which we come into Christ. Okay? The water of the word which washes the blood of sacrifice. We enter into his sacrifice by water and blood. So the bride of Christ, the second Adam, has been taken from his side like the bride of the first Adam. That's why he's called an Ish and she's called an Ishah. Great man and a great woman. But it was to end very shortly thereafterwards when sin entered the world. Now literally this phrase, Ish Adamah, means a man of the soil, a man of the ground. And so he planted a vineyard and wonderful grapes emerged in due season. What did he do with those grapes? Verse 21. And he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. Now it's fascinating that there are 8 words in the Old Testament for wine. Fully 8 words. It's interesting, isn't it? The one we have here in Genesis 9:21 is this one here, yayin. It means to ferment. It is used of every sort of wine. There are other words, however. Tirosh, from the root, which means to possess, that is, to possess the brain. And we'll talk about the effect of wine on the brain in a moment. Kima, to ripen, is used of strong red wine. Shikar, strong drink. Asis, new or sweet wine. Sober, sobi, to drink to excess and become drunk. They did not get the English word sober from that Hebrew word, did they? Because it's the opposite of what sober means. Middensack, mixed or spiced wine, and shemarim, old wine. So when you look through the Old Testament, there are 8 different words used to describe various kinds of wine. The wine that Noah produces, of course, is fermented, newly fermented wine. It's very powerful, and it has a very powerful effect upon him. And in fact, it brings awful things into his family. Now, what about this matter of wine? Well, the scripture has a lot to say about the effect of wine. And wine can be used in a good sense, it can be used in a bad sense. Wine, we know, is used of good doctrine. It's also used of bad doctrine. But wine, literal wine, taken in excess, has disastrous effects upon human beings. In Proverbs chapter 23, verses 29 to 35, we read this. Who hath woe? Who hath sorrow? Who hath contentions? Who hath babbling? Who hath wounds without cause? Who hath redness of eyes? They that tarry long at the wine. They that go to seek mixed wine. Now it's interesting that it should make this statement. The wise man says, who hath wounds without cause? In other words, if this man did not drink wine to excess, the wounds would not have been inflicted. So they're wounds without any real cause. They're brought about by his own or her own folly. So wine can have a very disastrous effect upon the human brain. And this is one of the effects. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, because it's addictive. It looks good. Tastes good, the so. When it giveth his colour in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. You know, you see these people who, the wine tasters, they spend the whole life as wine. They've got to spit it out, of course, otherwise they destroy their taste buds. But you see them, and they look at it, and they think, oh, look at the colour. My son and I were up camping once, way up on the top of the mountain somewhere. It was pouring with rain, and the rain stopped for a while. Along came these people. This is a very ordinary camping area. And they sat down at a picnic table, and they brought out a white tablecloth, and they set it out, and they put candles on the table. And they brought out bottles of wine. And my son and I were only 20 yards away, and we could hear them talking. And we were behind a shelter. They couldn't see us, but we could hear them talking. And they were saying, oh, that is so fruity. Oh, and they were carrying on like pork chops. And this is the way men treat it. You see, it becomes almost like It's a god, it's an idol to them. It becomes very addictive. And of course, it can have terrible results. At the last, it biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart shall utter perverse things. Yea, thou shalt be as he that lieth down the midst of the sea, or as he that lieth upon the top of a mast. Most unstable position to be in. They have stricken me, shalt thou say, and I was not sick. I brought this upon myself. They have beaten me, and I felt it not. When I shall awake, I realise better, yet I will seek it again. Isn't that just so true? I've observed that. I come from a family, I'm not talking about my Christadelphian family, I've got a wider family than that. Many of them are drunkards. My parents taught me from a very early age, because of what happened in their family, don't touch it. Now, I'm not against people who want to drink wine in a restaurant or whatever, providing it doesn't harm anybody else. But I don't touch it. You know why? I don't want my kids to end up like that. I do not want my kids to be like that. Be like my uncles and aunties ended up killing themselves through drunkenness. Alcoholism is one of the worst problems that can beset a man or a woman. It's very, very difficult to break the habit. It's very, very addictive. And that's what happened to Noah. Now, he didn't become an alcoholic, but he suffered from the effects of excess wine. This righteous man, that's what happened to him. And we read this in verse 21 again. He drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. So we've seen the effects of intoxication, as I said. This is the first time we find this word wine in the scripture, yayin. And there are several new Hebrew words that are used for the first time in this verse, including wine. So it's a very significant verse, and one of those is uncovered. Galah. In Australia we have people who we call galahs, because it's actually a bird that makes squawking noises. We call them galahs. Well, Noah was a galah in this instance. He was uncovered. It means to reveal oneself, and the Hebrew verb that is used here indicates an action done on one's own behalf. It's like the middle voice in the Greek. This was something he brought upon himself. Thus, it says, he uncovered himself. It's perfectly consistent with what we've read in Proverbs 23, verses 29 to 33. It produces a lack of control, it loosens our moral grip, and arouses sexual desire. Now, I have to be cautious here. There's things I can't say, and I don't want to excite your imagination too much, but I do want you to use your imagination, because I'm not going to say some of the things that I could say if I was talking to a smaller group, all of males. All right? But I can't say that in this room. But I can say this. If you have a look at Habakkuk chapter 2, you get a bit of an idea of what happens when wine is taken in excess. Habakkuk chapter 2. Now, this is about the rise of the Gogian dictator. It's based upon the Chaldean dictator of the past, Nebuchadnezzar, who came into the land of Judah. Habakkuk 2, of course, is in the context of the setting up of the kingdom of God. We know that from verse 14. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. Look what the next verse says. Woe unto him that giveth his neighbour drink, that putteth thy bottle to him, makest him drunken also, that thou mayest look on their nakedness. Thou art filled with shame for glory. Drink thou also, and let thy foreskin be uncovered. The cup of Yahweh's right hand shall be turned unto thee, and shameful spewing shall be on thy glory. You know that that passage has already been fulfilled. You know how Vladimir Putin became president of Russia? Because Yeltsin was in serious trouble. And the Prime Minister had appointed an investigator to look into the Yeltsin family finances, and they were going to be exposed as crooks. And so Yeltsin rang up the head of the KGB, or the FSB as it's now called, Mr. Vladimir Putin. And Putin said, "Don't worry, boss, I'll fix it up." And he set up this investigator, and he ended up in the KGB safe house with 2 women of dubious character, and the activities were filmed. He was primed with strong drink and filmed in his conduct with these 2 women, which was then played on Russian television. And Yeltsin was able to sack the investigator and survive. And as a reward, guess what? Within a few months, he handed the keys to the Kremlin to Vladimir Putin, a virtual unknown. That passage has been fulfilled. Put us thou bottle that thou mayest look upon their nakedness, and then put it on public television. So this is the rise of the Gogian dictator of the last days. Now, whether Putin is Gog or not, I'm not suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is that Putin has established a Gogian-style dictatorial autocracy in Russia, exactly like the Tsars. It's based on the Tsarist model. It's exactly what has to happen in Ezekiel 38, verse 2. So that's just an aside, but it gives you an idea. When you take too much wine, one of the prices you pay is a loosening of your moral standing. Like the proverb says, you'll look upon strange women. Now, we don't know that Noah was involved in anything like that, but we do know this, that he was exposed, sexually exposed, and he was seen in that posture by his son Ham. So let's come back to Genesis chapter 9. Because it says in verse 22, "And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brethren without," which means that he was inside the tent. Here he saw his father Noah lying on some sort of mattress or whatever in that tent. And he was fully exposed, totally naked. And I won't go any further. And Ham saw it. And he didn't have any real problem with that. And he went out to tell his brothers, Shem and Japheth. And the word nakedness that is used here is the Hebrew word urvar. And it means nakedness or nudity, shame or pudenda. That is the generative organs. It's the first occurrence of this word in the Old Testament in a very significant place. But this word is used throughout Leviticus 18 and 20 of uncovering nakedness. I do want you to have a look at Leviticus 20 verse 11. This word is predominant in this context. So what is it talking about? Right through Leviticus 18 and right through Leviticus 20, you have this phrase, uncovering the nakedness. Let's have a look at chapter 20 verse 11. "And the man that lieth with his father's wife hath uncovered his father's nakedness, urvar. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them." So you see, we are told here in this verse that uncovering the nakedness is a euphemism for sexual relationships. That's what it is. So this is the word that is used back there with Noah. Now there's nobody else in the tent that we're aware of except Ham comes in. We're not sure about Canaan. I'll make a few suggestions about Canaan in a moment, the son of Ham. But whatever was happening there was not pretty. It was not pretty. And so sin enters the family of Noah through the failure of the father of the family. He becomes drunk with excess of wine. So let's come back to Genesis chapter 9. The use of this word implies shameful nakedness rather than simple nudity. The word for simple nudity in the Old Testament is eron. It is used 10 times in the Old Testament. So when you're just talking about someone who has got no clothes on, the Hebrew word is eron. You use urvar, it implies something a little worse. In fact, this word eron occurs 3 times in Genesis chapter 3 in verse 7, 10 and 11. "Who told thee that thou wast naked?" Eron. Okay? They realise that they've been created that way. But now they realise, after sin, that they were naked. What happens here, back in Genesis chapter 9? Well, we see the behaviour of Ham. He goes into the tent, he comes out and tells his two brethren. In verse 23 we read this: "And Shem and Japheth took a garment, and they laid it upon both of their shoulders, and they went backward." Now you think about the logistics of this. There's a tent, Noah's inside, Ham comes out and says, "Dad's naked in there." And the two boys, Shem and Japheth, not really boys, they're grown men, they get a blanket, some sort of garment, and they say, "Right, let's back up." So they put the garment over their shoulder, hang on like this, and they back up and they go into the tent without looking at their father, and when they stumble over him, they drop the garment over Noah to cover him up. So what we're going to learn about the three sons of Noah is different characteristics. And this becomes the basis of the prophecies that Noah makes, which have far-reaching effects, not only in the history of the world, but in the purpose of God, as we're going to see. And what we do find when we read this section of Scripture is the several characters in Noah's family encapsulate all types within the ecclesial family. Remember that these people, Noah's family, came out of the ark. What's that? Well, it's the ecclesia. It's the place of salvation. Right? How do you get in the ark? Well, you're surrounded by water. Baptism. That's how Peter uses it in 1 Peter chapter 3. You get baptised. You're surrounded by water in the ark. So there are a lot of different characters in the ecclesia, aren't there? That's one of the things we have to deal with. Different approaches, different characteristics in the ecclesia of God. So there's Noah. He was upright. We've seen that in our first study. He was an upright man. He walked with God. But he had weaknesses. He was subject to weakness and failure. He's not an orphan in that regard, is he? So he represents the earnest Christadelphian. But he's a weak sinner, like we all are. We have our failings. So we can see ourselves perhaps in Noah. What about his other boys? Let's take Ham. He's an ungrateful man, devoid of respect and honour for his father. He's arrogant and a spiteful sinner. Why? Because he comes out, he's virtually laughing at his father. God, Dad's in there uncovered. He has absolutely no respect for his father. What about Shem? Well, he's sensitive and respectful. He's the godly class in Noah's family. What about Japheth, the oldest boy? Well, he's dependent on others for leadership. He should be providing leadership, but he's dependent on others. He's willing to conform and to do what's right, but he needs Shem to help him. We've got a few people like that in the ecclesia, haven't we? And what about Canaan, the son of Ham? He's privately base and corrupt, and very quick to take advantage of others' weaknesses. Now I want to suggest as to where Ham might fit into the story, rather where Canaan fits into the story. Because I want you to notice something. When we come to the prophecy of Noah, in verse 24 it says this: "And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him." So it's explained to him what had happened. You know, it's very hard to remember what happened the day before when you're stone drunk. Not that I've ever been drunk, but I'm told that that's the case. Can't remember what happened. So he has to be told. And it says what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant shall he be unto his brethren." Hang on. Didn't I read back in verse 22? "And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father." So why does Noah blast Canaan? Why not Ham? You've got to ask yourself the question, don't you? That seems like a conundrum. But you're given the clue in verse 22. "And Ham, the father of Canaan." Now you don't read of Shem and his son or Japheth and his son, do you? So what we're being told in verse 22 is that both Ham and his son Canaan were involved in seeing the exposure of Noah. Now, what part then would Canaan have played in this? And why does Noah, in his prophecy, which is obviously an inspired prophecy, why does he turn on Canaan and not on Ham? We've got to answer that question. Almost certainly he was involved in the transgression with his father, was this boy Canaan. Perhaps in the aftermath, when Ham emerged to declare Noah's fate, perhaps he and his father joked and laughed about what was happening to Noah inside the tent. He may have rushed in to look at Noah while Shem and Japheth fetched a covering for their father. The complete word study of the Old Testament suggests he may have been involved in some indecent behaviour with Noah before Ham entered the scene. Now that's a creative suggestion. It may or may not be correct. I don't know. What I do know is that the prophecy is against Canaan. And there has to be a reason for that. And I think the major reason is this. He is the father of the Canaanitish nations that Yahweh said he would spew out of the land because of their immorality, their promiscuity, their depravity in both domestic and religious life. And we've been to Leviticus chapter 20, and chapter 18 makes that statement. It makes the statement when God says through Noah to the children of Israel, when you come into this land, don't behave like the Canaanites, whom I have spewed out before you. They are so intolerable in their behaviour. I've spewed them out of my mouth, got them out of my land. Don't you be like them. So you see, Canaan is the father of the Canaanites with whom Israel had to deal. Who was the first of God's people that had to deal with Canaanites? His name is Abram. And we are told in Genesis chapter 12 twice, and the Canaanite was then in the land, and they were Abraham's challenge. And we've got the same challenge today, haven't we? We live in a world full of Canaanites. You know what Canaan means? Bend the knee. In other words, get down on the ground. Bow down on the ground. That's what it means. And so it's all about servitude to the earth, servitude to flesh. So the Canaanite springs from this boy who obviously got tangled up in this dreadful scene in the history of Noah's family. And of course, out of that has come some awful things. Well then, let's move on to the blessing on Shem. You know, this 25th verse about cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. I got myself into serious trouble recently on one of these tours, and I made a statement that 30 years ago it would have been impossible for a black man, a Negro, to ever become the President of the United States of America. And I, because of the spirit that's in our brotherhood now, liberty, equality and fraternity, I had people challenging me over that statement. But I came back and said, it's biblical. What I said was biblical. And Genesis 9 verse 25 is the answer. Because Ham is the father of the dark races. And God said of Ham, a servant of servants would he be. And of course the spirits of liberty, equality and fraternity have turned that upside down. Anyway, that's an aside. Might do a bit more of that sort of stuff Sunday morning. What about Shem? Verse 26. And he said, blessed be Yahweh God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Now Shem, the name, means a name. And a name in the sense of renown, a distinct name. And he's clearly a type of Christ in this context. There's no question about that. Because you see, I don't think there's any doubt that Shem was Melchizedek. And there's any doubt about that, and Brother Thomas felt the same. Scripture, of course, doesn't want us to know who Melchizedek was because of the type. Without father, without mother, without heritage, without, all that sort of stuff. And of course, Shem was a man like you and me, and Adam was his father, and so was Noah. And there's no doubt that Shem became Melchizedek in due time, and therefore he is very much a type of Christ. What does he do? Well, he shows respect and honour to his father, as you would expect of a man who's a type of Christ. He provides a covering for a weak sinner, as you would expect of a man who's a type of Christ. He leads others by example, as you would expect of a man who's a type of Christ. So you see the point? The things that he does stamp him out as a type of Christ. And of course in Acts chapter 4 and verse 12, Peter makes this statement. Neither is there salvation in any other, he says, before the Sanhedrin, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. No other name? Yeah, no other Shem. Peter was a Hebrew. He knew that the word for name was Shem. There's no other Shem, no other name given under heaven whereby men might be saved. So that's the blessing on Shem. And we'll see a bit more about that in a minute. Verse 27 goes on to say, and God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. So the three sons of Noah are being dealt with, except with this little proviso. Ham doesn't get a mention in this prophecy. It's Canaan, his son, who gets the mention. And we're going to see that the curse upon Canaan and the blessing upon Shem play a very important part in the call of Abraham and in the promises that you and I have believed. So the translation of Young's Literal, Genesis 9:26, is blessed of Yahweh, my God, is Shem. This happens to be the sixth occurrence of the word Barak in the Old Testament, the word for blessed, so what's in green. This is the word Barak, the sixth occurrence. Now in Genesis 9:25 we read, cursed be Canaan, which happens to be the fifth occurrence of this word in the Hebrew, Arah. You might say, well, what are you talking about that for? Well, the seventh occurrence of Barak is in the promise of Genesis chapter 12. God makes to Abraham. We're going to see where the sixth occurrence of the word cursed comes in a moment. The principle being established here in the prophecy of Noah is that honourable behaviour brings a blessing, while the opposite produces a curse. Now that's not a hard equation to understand, is it? Honourable behaviour brings a blessing, dishonourable behaviour brings a curse. And that's spelled out in Genesis 12 verse 3. When God makes his promise to Abraham in Ur the Chaldees and then repeats it in Haran, this is what he said to him. I will bless them that bless thee. Guess what word it is? Barak. And curse him that curseth thee. Guess what word this is? Curse him. Arah. It's the sixth occurrence. 6 the number of man. 7 the number of the covenant. This is a different word, curseth. This is the Hebrew word qualal, means to make light of or despicable, and hence to curse. And what God is saying to Abraham is simply this, because we know what the blessing of Abraham is, don't we? We know what God meant when he talked to Abraham in that way, that I will bless them that bless thee. And we'll see that in a moment when we come to have a look at Acts chapter 3 verse 20. This is about redeeming people. The blessing is about redeeming them. I will redeem them that follow your example. That is, see what I've done with you, Abraham, and follow it. But I will curse, like Noah cursed Canaan, I will curse him that makes light of what I've done with you. And they look and see what I've done with you, Abraham, and said, that's not for me. I'll curse them, like Canaan was cursed. So you can see why these words are highly significant in the context of Genesis 9 and 12. Because these are the words that are the roots of Genesis 12 verse 3. On the one hand we have blessing. Shem and Japheth honoured their father and bestowed the blessing of a covering upon him. And they inherited, therefore, a blessing. And those who bless Abraham received the blessing of a covering for sin and ultimate redemption. And that's what Peter says when he quotes Genesis 12 in Acts chapter 3, when 3,000 people are baptised. This is what he said to them at the end of his discourse. He says, unto you, the Jews, first, God, having raised up his son Jesus, sent him to bless you. And he's just quoted from Genesis. So what does he mean by blessing? Well, he tells them what he means by blessing, by what God meant in turning away every one of you from his iniquities. So when you got baptised, you believed in the promises made to Abraham, didn't you? Well, you should have. And that promise is, I will bless them that bless thee. Do you understand that? What God was saying to you when you read that promise was, you respect what I did with Abraham. You're following the example of Abraham. And I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to turn you away from your iniquities. I'm not going to give up on you. I'm going to work in your life until you are turned away from your iniquities, just like I did with Abraham. That's his blessing. Do you realise that? That's the Abrahamic blessing. God takes you as his children and says, I'm going to work with you until your iniquities are turned away. He got Abraham to that place, didn't he? And Abraham offered up his own son. God says, in blessing, I will bless thee. You'll be in the kingdom. That's what he meant. You will be in the kingdom. So the blessing is redeeming people. See? It's very, very important we understand it. But there's an opposite side to that too. There's cursing. Ham and Canaan made light of Noah's predicament. Didn't they? They made light of it. Oh, Dad's uncovered. And they inherited the curse of servitude. And those who make light of Abraham also inherit a curse. Servitude and ultimate rejection. Principle applies both to individuals and to nations and to peoples in the general sense, especially to individuals. And this is the process that God is using in our life. Now let's come to Japheth, because all of us have an interest in Japheth. Everybody in this room is a Japhethite. Do you know that? White-skinned, Japhethites. So we have an interest in this prophecy about Japheth. Verse 27, Genesis chapter 9. And God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. What does that mean? Well, Japheth means, and he's the oldest son of Noah, by the way. You know that from Genesis chapter 10, verse 21. He might not be mentioned first. You know, it says in the record of Genesis chapter 6 that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth. You read that order, you think, well, Japheth's the younger. Sorry, Ham's the younger. Japheth's the older. So Japheth means expansion or enlarged or wide spreading. And so there's a play upon words here, isn't it? God shall enlarge the enlarger. That's what his name means. And Rotherham translates it this way. God give extension to Japheth, but make his habitation in the tents of Shem. And we're going to talk about this tents of Shem in a moment. And let Canaan be their servant. Now, Canaan represents the flesh. See, what he's saying here is that Shem is going to triumph. Christ is going to triumph. And those who have followed Shem, like Japheth did, into the tent, all right, will be blessed. But flesh, sin, carnality, manifested in Ham and Canaan, will be cursed. See, there's a prophecy here, isn't there? It's about the work of God. So we've got an interest in this because we're involved in it. It's actually going on in our life every day. If the truth's at work, this is what's happening every day. This Shem, Ham, Japheth principle. And Noah's prophecy has been fulfilled in part. Japheth is the progenitor of the white races, who spread across almost the entire Eurasian continent. How many of you have heard of the word Eurasian? 3 or 4 in the audience? Good. I was challenged on that once. A brother came and said, oh, you know, that's not a word. I said, well, it is actually. Go and look at the dictionary. So I went and looked at the dictionary. Yes, it's a word. Eurasian means European and Asian. So it's the whole of the continent, that Eurasian continent, right across the top of the earth. That's what we're talking about here. Now, taken from a national perspective, that prophecy has been fulfilled in the colonisation of many far-off lands. And we, of course, are subject to that. I mean, I'm an Australian. I'm not actually. I'm a Japhethite. I just happen to live in Australia because that's where I was born. Most of you are Americans, okay? But you're not really. You're Japhethites. You didn't, you know, it's the Indians who were the original inhabitants of this country, like the Aborigines were of Australia. We were colonists. We came in, and we are actually from Japheth. However, from a religious perspective, Christianity claims to now dwell in the tents of Shem, don't they? You go to any church in the city of Joplin and walk in the front door, what do they claim to be? Well, these are the representatives of Christ, aren't they, on the earth? We are the church of Christ, they say. We're actually in the tents of Shem, the name, Christ. That's where we belong. They don't, but they think they do. And one day they will, like you and me, are now in the tents of Shem. Because of their origins in Christianity, they claim to be in the tents of Shem. Because, of course, we know that the Church, the Roman Church and the Russian Orthodox Church claim the holy sites in the land. They say that those holy sites belong to them. They actually have fist fights over that. Did you know that? In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, almost every second day there's a fist fight that goes on between the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox and the Christian representatives who are fighting and squabbling over what they think is the tomb of Christ. They think they're in the tents of Shem, and they're so upset by someone challenging that they're prepared to beat each other up. Now, there's another aspect of this subject which we're going to consider, because you see, Gog comes from Japheth too. So when Gog comes into the land, Japheth comes into the land. He will be motivated by the desire to possess the holy sites, to dwell in the tents of Shem, so to speak, when he comes to take the land. Armageddon, of course, is caused by religious factors, not just political and economic factors. It's the religious factor that drives Gog into the land. So then let's just have a look and see the way in which some of these prophecies have been fulfilled. Japheth, in the scheme of things, equals what they used to call Caucasians. Now, occasionally you hear this term on radio or see it in the newspaper. They talk about Caucasians. Now, all of us are Caucasians. It's a term once used by anthropologists to refer to a racial group consisting primarily of light-skinned peoples of Europe, North Africa, Western Asia and India. The designation Caucasian, this is from Microsoft Encarta Encyclopedia, was first used in the 19th century by scholars who believed that white Europeans originated in Caucasia, a region of southeastern Europe. Now here's the Caucasus Mountains, okay? The Caucasus Mountains gave this region its name, Caucasia. And because this is where Japheth, here's the Ararat Mountains down here, see? This is where the ark rested, and Japheth went north. They said, well, Japhethites are Caucasians, because they're up in the region of the Caucasus Mountains. That's how we got that term. Now, you don't hear it that often nowadays, but 30, 40 years ago, you went in to apply for a job and they say, are you Caucasian? And you say, yes, I'm a Caucasian. You knew what the term meant, that you were actually a descendant of Japheth. Well then, what happened in history? You know, prophecy is a marvellous thing, isn't it? Prophecy is the mould into which history is poured. God makes this prophecy through Noah. It's inspired, therefore it has to happen. He will make it happen. And guess what happened? Japheth, who initially and originally was up here, all right? He spread out over the Eurasian continent. This is where Japheth was originally found. Well, guess what happened? As the wheels turned, in history? Well, there was colonisation. So both North America and South America were inhabited by Japhethites. And it didn't stop there, because the British began to colonise and they came to Australia. The Dutch came to Indonesia. The British went into India. They went into South Africa, as did the Germans and the Dutch. So you see, Japheth is now spread over all the world. And prophecy's been fulfilled. God shall enlarge the enlarger. So there's a fulfilment from that perspective. But there's something far more important about this prophecy. Because when Gog comes into the land, Gog is a Japhethite, and that's why these names occur in Ezekiel 38. Japheth spawned Gomer, and you can look this up. The children of Japheth include Gomer, Magog, Madai, that's the Medes, that's Persia, Javan, that's the Greeks, Tubal, Meshech, Togarmah, and Tarshish. And all of them are involved in the events of Ezekiel 38. All of them. So don't let anybody tell you that Gog is the Arabs. It's rubbish. Gog is a Japhethite, okay, but nothing to do with the Arabs. It's a very strong proof about the nonsense that we've heard over the last 40 years on Bible prophecy, that the Arabs will defeat Israel. Absolute nonsense. Arabs come from Shem, the children of Abraham. The sons of Japheth will initially dwell in the tents of Shem as aggressors. You know, it says in Daniel chapter 11 verse 45 that when Gog, the king of the north, comes down upon the land, having become the little horn of the goat, he enters into the land, he defeats the forces there, and he establishes what's called the tent, the Ohel, of his power. In my glorious holy mountain, saith Yahweh, between the seas. So there's the tent of Gog set up in Jerusalem, or near Jerusalem, when he has his victory over the powers of Tarshish and others who oppose him. Now that is how Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem for a while. They do it today through their religious apostasy and their claiming of the holy sites. They'll do it tomorrow by the invasion of the land. They want to dwell in the tents of Shem, but they're doing it as aggressors. Yahweh has a different purpose in mind. He's going to finally bring all of these peoples into the tents of Shem on the basis of the Abrahamic promises. That's what he intends to do. And ultimately they will dwell there as worshippers, sharing the blessings of Shem, the man whose name means the name. And God is calling out with the nations a people for his Shem, for his name. And he will fulfill that purpose in due course. Now I can look up all those references, obviously, but that just gives you a bit of an idea. If you look up those references, you'll find that they all refer in part to the fulfilment of the prophecy of Noah, that ultimately God will have all peoples in the tents of Shem. But initially, they will attempt to do this by their aggression. So Japheth and Ham, because there will be representatives of Ham in the invasion of the land, will attempt to seize the tents of Shem, and they will bring down their forces from all points of the compass into the land of promise. They will be opposed by other descendants of Japheth, the Tarshish powers, and other descendants of Shem, Sheba and Dedan. Okay? So what we read in Ezekiel 38 and Zechariah 14 and chapters like that was all prefigured back here in Genesis chapter 9. Like I said to you, there's no prophecy anywhere else in the Bible. It doesn't have its roots back here. It's all from Genesis chapter 9 through 12. And you know, you go to the Tsarist hymn book. This is interesting. This is the Tsarist hymn book. The anthem of the Tsars. God Save the Tsar. This music is by Alexei Lvov. The words by Vasily Sokolsky. Now they're Japhethites, as you can see by their names. Alright? They're white races. And this is part of the Tsarist anthem, verse 3. God save Orthodox Rus, or Russia, first among nations. Why? Because Japheth's the elder. They're claiming their eldership. First among the nations. Make her kingdom harmonious. Serene in her strength and cast out all that is base. Read Canaan. That's their anthem. Where'd they get that from, I wonder? Well, this is what God intends to do with them when He's finished with them. I want you to come to Isaiah chapter 16. Isaiah chapter 16. Now I'm finishing early today in this session because the next session you're going to have to come in that door with your thinking caps on. Alright? I'll give you a 10-minute break. An extra 10-minute break. Because next session is thinking cap time. Anyway, let's have a look at Isaiah 16 and verse 5. And before I read that verse, let me just read the one that's on the screen. Another passage from Isaiah, 56 verse 7. Even then, and this is talking about the eunuchs and the strangers, says Yahweh, who keep my covenant. This is their end. I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. For mine house shall be called an house of prayer for all people. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Alright? All people came from the loins of Noah. None of us are outside that equation. When we read Isaiah 16 verse 5, we read this. And in mercy shall the throne be established. This is the throne of David, which you'll see in the next couple of lines. And he shall sit upon it in truth, Emeth, in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hasting righteousness, or speeding righteousness. Now that's telling us the same thing as this passage. It's about this building, where on the eastern side the throne of David will be established. And Christ will inhabit the eastern side of this house, which by the way is this side. Alright? He will inhabit the eastern side. He will dwell in this outer row of buildings here. The gates will be shut because there will be no entry and no departure from the gates on the east. And for 1,000 years, he will remain in that house, while the saints do his bidding throughout the earth. You know what that building's called in Isaiah 16 verse 5? It's a tabernacle. You know what the word is in the Hebrew? Ohel. It should be rendered tent. If the translators have been consistent, it should have been rendered tent. Because an ohel is a round tent. That looks like a round tent, doesn't it? Because you see, what you're looking at there is not what you will see in the kingdom. What you will see in the kingdom, if you're outside the building, is a cloud that goes from the inner wall of the circular sanctuary over the mountain, so the mountain's not actually seen. All you see is the cloud covering it. It'll be like a tent. It is a tent. And every one of every nation, whether they be from Shem, Ham, or Japheth, will go and worship in that tent. And for a time, they will all dwell in the tent of Shem, the name bearer, who will remain there for 1,000 years, ruling over the earth. What a wonderful prophecy that is. So I've said, no prophecy you find elsewhere doesn't have its roots in Genesis 9 to 12.